Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I just had this random topic in my head of like JRPG parties. And what I mean by that is like the main characters of like a JRPG. Just a conversation about big and small parties when it comes to JRPGs. Because I feel like typically when you have a JRPG, it's like the party ranges anywhere between 6 and 8. Usually that's the average of any game. Most JRPGs I feel like fall in that line, but there are exceptions where it's like some are smaller, some are bigger, like smaller scale. Look, like take Final Fantasy for example, like the series as a whole, typically those probably have usually the average length, but obviously there have been exceptions. I mean, to be fair, like this is just coming from my experience. I've not played every Final Fantasy, so I don't know, but I feel like majority of the series has the average amount of party members. And then you have stuff like Final Fantasy X-2 where you only have 3 characters, or Final Fantasy 13-3 where you played only 1 character, at least to my knowledge. And then like 15, you're only playing 4 characters. But then you have something like Type 0, which had like, what, 12 or 13 characters? Like if you want to go on like the bigger side of things. Because it's such an interesting thing to me, because I guess it's like, I guess if you have like a bigger cast, I guess it can be good because that means that different characters you get to know and play with. But I guess the argument could also be told like, you know, storytelling wise, those characters might not get as much if there's a whole bunch of them. They might not have like the biggest story relevance and just might be like, oh, you're here and then you're kind of out. Like one example, and it's something I've talked about before, is like take Final Fantasy Tactics. Like once a main character is removed from the storyline, that was always my biggest gripe, is like once like there's a special, you know, story character that joins Ramza's party, they disappear from the storyline. I think there's a maximum, like I think 18 or 21 was like the maximum amount of characters you could have, and like that 17 or 20 would be like the maximum amount of other characters that would be in your max party. That's just one thing of like, yeah, once they join your party, they kind of disappear from the story. So I'm wondering, like, does that have any bearings on why some people do that, like bigger parties, and others don't? Just because it's like, it's hard enough juggling a whole bunch of characters storyline wise, because I feel like there's always going to be someone that ends up suffering from it, not getting enough push, or maybe like out of nowhere you get a whole bunch of story from them just because of that. Because there's some other games that I'm familiar with that have shorter, smaller parties. Part of the Wild Arms series, I'd say like the first one might have only had 3 characters. I didn't realize that at the time, but I think it only had 3. I think 2 had quite a few. I don't remember. 3 and 4 definitely only had 4 each. But then 5 brought back and had like 6. Then there's also the Grandia series. That's interesting because I don't remember. I think there was only like 3 or 4 characters for the first game. I want to say 3, but I don't remember. 2, definitely. There was 4, technically 5, because one of your characters, I think it was Elena is her name, she turns into a different character, so that's a little bit different. But you, at any point in time, it's 4 characters at most. And in Grandia 3, technically there were 6 party members, but 2 of them, was it Alonzo and Yuki's mom, Miranda, are only around for like the beginning, and then like after a little while they leave the party and never come back. That's on that side of the things. But then there's also, like I said, the bigger parties when it comes to JRPGs like Chrono Cross, just because like there is a crap ton of characters, which is interesting because with that, it's like, because I don't know like the story relevance in all of those characters. Like I doubt like they all have like, they probably have their own little personal stories, maybe, but it's never going to be anything major plot. I mean, to be fair, a lot of that was back in the day where there were no cutscenes, so it's not like you had to get like a whole bunch of different voice actors and stuff like that. Nowadays, you probably would in certain regards like that, but it's just interesting because that's like a big difference, you know. Obviously, well, there's a lot of difference between that and Chrono Trigger, but still it's just kind of interesting to think like, oh man, like Chrono Trigger only had 6 itself, technically 7, but I don't count that 7 because that 7 ends up being a replacement. It's like the whole, was it like Magnus, you can get him in your party like when Chrono's going, or you can get Chrono back. Another one that kind of had like a larger cast that I thought was kind of interesting is the Suikoden series, because that actually plays a big part in the story too, because like getting all, ain't it like 106 or 107 gives you the true ending. That's a different situation in certain regards, because it's like obviously you need certain characters to get other characters. I think the same thing might apply in Chrono Cross, but to be fair, like these are like older games, like Chrono Cross being a PlayStation game. Same thing for some of the Suikodens, except for like 2 and 5 were like, I mean 4 and 5 were on the PS2, but those are kind of like, that's one series where I'm like, yeah, that's a consistent amount of like characters. I don't know if they've made like because I'm not that well versed in a Suikoden series, but like beyond 5, I don't know if there's been another numbered title. I know there's a whole bunch of spin-offs, and I don't know if they reflect the same thing or not. It's also interesting, if you've never played the Star Ocean series, they handle the party system very interesting in that as well. In that regard of like, it's one of the few video game series in certain regards where you cannot get all the party members. Like, it is just not possible. I don't know as much in 1. I want to say it probably happened in 1 just because it's very big amongst other titles in the series. But like definitely 2, because I think 2, because you play 2 different characters. I want to say the 2 main characters are Claude and her name Reina, I want to say. But basically, depending on who you select, also changes the difficulty of the game. Like, I think Reina's, because it's basically the same story, but it's kind of told from different perspectives. Her perspective, her storyline is a little easier than Claude's, at least that's what I've heard. But basically, depending on who you chose, that will determine what characters you're able to get later on throughout the game. And that's something that's reflected in Star Ocean 3, not in that same regard, but there are certain characters you can't get. Like, once you choose a certain party member, like, because there's certain characters that will always join your party. I'm pretty sure that applies in the other Star Oceans as well, like at least 1 and 2. Like I said, if 1 is like that, but it's like there are always going to be those characters that are part of the story that will always be a part of your party, but then there's always going to be those options of like, there's some characters you'll have a choice of like, oh, who do you want to take along with you, and so it kind of locks you out of other characters and stuff like that, which always kind of bothered me a little bit. I don't have a lot of experience with the Star Ocean series. Like, the first one I ever played was 3, and that was my first experience with that, so like I've never seen another game do that. I'm not saying it's the only one that does that, but that's the only one I'm really aware of, which kind of bothers me, because it's like, oh, there's these characters, but you never get to use them, and so there's that whole thing. So they did change it though, because in 4 that's not an option. Like, there's like 8 characters in 4, but technically it's 9, but one of your characters gets exchanged. Like, I forgot his name because it's been a while, but there's that Eldarian with the scythe. He replaces Phase in your party. So, like I said, rather than an addition, it's more of a substitution. So, and I'm not sure about 5, but I haven't seen enough of 5 to know, and I haven't played it either, so I don't know if it does the same thing or not. But like, going back to what I was saying, like, because 4, it's like you get the entire party, so that's something I kind of like. The Dot Hack series typically has like a decent chunk of characters, but a lot of those are characters you don't have to get there. A lot of them are optional, just because, like, because obviously the Dot Hack series like continues upon itself, so it's like, oh, you carry over your data from the previous game into the new game, and if you don't, like, if you never, like, say for example, if you with the original Dot Hack series, say like you're jumping to Mutation and you never played Infection, that's, you know, that's me saying you played part 2 but you never played part 1, but in that regard there will be certain optional characters that you won't get, like, because there's the main characters, because like the whole game is built around like, oh, if you never played the original, or at least don't have any save data anymore, you can play the game and it's almost like you play the first one. But obviously all the like optional characters you could have gotten in the first game you never get, which is interesting because there's certain characters I think that fall into the category of optional, which is interesting. Like, I could be 100% wrong about it, but isn't Sanjuro technically optional? Maybe he isn't. Maybe I'm just misremembering, because it's like, if that was the case, that's really interesting, considering the fact is that I'm pretty sure he's popped up in other mediums amongst the Dot Hack series. Like, it was like Twilight Bracelet or whatever, Sanjuro popped up in that, so that's why I was kind of like, that's kind of interesting. That's one of those games where it doesn't affect too much, just because like if it's an optional character they probably won't have any storyline, which is interesting though, because like, but that is the thing of like, that was a PlayStation 2 game and those characters had dialogue. So like, dialogue was recorded for them and stuff like that, but obviously they didn't have like the mainstay and big part of the story like other characters did, you know, the main party. So I guess that's always an interesting way to kind of divide it up, is like, if you did have a bigger roster or whatever, include a, you know, the main people who get all the attention, get all the story, and then like the other side people who are just optional people that you can get. I don't know, it's kind of an interesting thing. Like, I guess in my mind, I just prefer like being able to have options, but sometimes I'm okay with not having options, because that way you don't have, because like you have to micromanage a lot of people in a JRPG. If you have a whole bunch of people, it's like, that's a lot, because I hate playing favorites. Like, everyone has their favorites when it comes to a JRPG party, but the fact of the matter is I hate doing that, because I recently started, I got the Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy 10 and 10-2 HD remaster, and I like balance a lot. Like I try to use every character so everyone kind of stays on par. Kind of like, I don't think I always did that, but now, you know, just because it's been years since I played Final Fantasy and I'm older now, I try to balance it a little bit more. But everyone's got their favorite party members where it's like, oh, I always use this group and I'm never going to really use anyone else, but I try to keep somewhat of a balance, you know. There's actually another example in my head I thought was kind of interesting, and it kind of flows with certain games, and that's like Persona 3 FPS and Infinite Undiscovery, where it's like you control the main protagonist in both regards, but you don't have complete control of the other party. Like using Persona 3 FPS, that version of Persona, you can control your main character, but the other characters in your party were automatic. The same thing applies in Infinite Undiscovery. You can join and connect with your characters, kind of tell them what to do, but typically they'll kind of do their own thing, and you never get to play as any of the other characters. So to me, that's such an interesting thing when it comes to a party system, where it's like you only get to control one character. I guess the same thing could apply to Final Fantasy 15, but they did later on, I think it was a later change that they made, where you could switch to the other party members. Not all the time, but it's only like in the middle of battle. Kind of going back to the Infinite Undiscovery example is interesting because you don't even get access to every party member that's in that game. So it kind of takes the choice out of you, because there's certain characters that are labeled as like secondary, meaning like only on certain like level points where it's like you have to have multiple parties, then those characters can be used. Otherwise than that, you never get a chance to actually play with them in your party. So that kind of always bothered me about that game, but I guess it was just kind of an interesting way to kind of give you options while also taking options away from you. Like I said, it was just kind of an interesting thing. Like I said, this was just something random that was in my head, and ultimately that kind of leads me to my question, like, what is your preference when it comes to JRPGs, when it comes to party size? Like, do you prefer, you know, a bigger party, a smaller party, an average party? Let me know why, and give me some examples of like some games, you know, maybe I listed and some I didn't, that kind of fit that criteria of like, oh yeah, like this is the perfect party size for me. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. But really, that's all I want to talk about in this video. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.